Hello and welcome in something different for once than Conan Exiles, and what we're gonna be doing today in Car Mechanic Simulator 2021, we're gonna be rebuilding Bolt Atlanta, so let's go. The purchase value of it was 3,798 credits, and we're gonna go from this to this in about 15 minutes of full rebuild video, so let's jump straight into it. First things first, I had to have a quick look around at the body of the car and started disassembling all of the outside parts of it, as in windows, bumpers, light, this kinda stuff. Then a quick check quickly reveals that the car has gained, somehow, value, even though we have been disassembling some of the stuff, and it should technically be losing value, but hey. As the shell of Bolt Atlanta was somewhat dealt with, I had to basically have a look inside and take care of the interior before we could carry on with our project. So, first of all, we had to do some detailing work on the interior before we could fit a new steering wheel and new seats. Okay, so we can put our equipment away and finally fit some brand new seats and a new steering wheel. Every time I finished with a specific car category, as in interior or body, I tend to check if the condition is at 100%, because this way I'm 100% sure that the job was properly done and I haven't missed anything. Next in the queue was to do some welding, so we could restore the body condition to 100%. Okay, now that the body has been somewhat restored, we can start putting some new parts on the car to make it whole. The things that you've just seen me mounting, as in both front lights, both rear lights and both bumpers, they were from the custom shop, so they are not really original parts for this car, but hey. The remaining components, as in windows, mirrors, both doors, hood, trunk door, they were OEM parts, so we can restore it to somewhat original condition and look. I've put 2 cherries on top of a massive cake by mounting 2 registration plates to be done with the shell. Now we could go ahead and prepare the car for painting. I wasn't entirely sure what kind of color I want this car to be in by the time I'm finished with it, but before I've started welding the body, as in fixing it, I've noticed it had some shade of greenish on it being present. So, to honor the original OEM color, I've chosen this shade of green. Now that we had body, frame and interior conditions capped at 100%, plus we had this nice shade of green, we could finally start replacing the remaining, broken components of this car. Different people will give it different names, but I used the car lift to bring it to workable heights so that I could start removing broken components. And by removing broken components, I literally mean taking off every single rusty part that's remaining on this car at this point. I will skip ahead to the point where just an empty shell is left and we can start assembling the engine and suspension with brand new parts. Okay, here we go. So you have to start assembling the engine by placing the engine block, followed by performance fuel filter, power steering reservoir, battery, brake servo and fuse box. Atlanta's fuse box requires 3 Type A relays, 1 Type B and 1 Type C, followed by 2 medium fuses of Type A, 1 of Type B and 1 of Type C. Once we got all fuses in place, it's the time to close the fuse box. Now we can assemble the ignition distributor with help of ignition distributor rotor, mounting ignition coil in the meantime, and finally the ignition distributor cap. Then we can move on to mounting a performance fuel pump, water pump, obviously to keep our car cool, and water pump pulley. Next comes in the radiator as a part of our cooling system loop. And arm that's gonna be used to hold a performance type alternator. 2 screws to secure it in place, and we can move on to mounting windscreen washer fluid reservoir, which is this big container right here. Okay. Now we have to put the crankshaft in its place so we can start assembling more important internal engine components. And secure it in its place with crankshaft bearing caps. And now the best part, performance pistons and piston rings. To prevent pistons from just jumping out of the block, we have to place engine head on top of them. Then, valve pushrods have to be placed to allow rockers to operate properly. And then aforementioned rockers to allow valves to open and close. Performance spark plugs to properly ignite fuel and air mixture. And performance ignition wires so they could deliver enough power to spark plugs to do their job. Engine head cover goes on top of all that. Once again we are going to use a performance component, and this time it's going to be exhaust manifold. This is going to allow engine to effectively remove the exhaust gases. Followed by performance intake manifold so that it could introduce enough air into the fuel mixture. And performance carb to distribute almighty petrol into the combustion chamber. Now is the time to assemble the air filter by placing air filter base, performance rated filter itself and the cover. A quick check what we can do next. And at this point I thought I'll be lifting the car up to work underneath, however I realized I can and should insert a camshaft at this point. Followed by installing an arm that's gonna hold the power steering pump. Yet another 2 screws and we are on to mounting the cam gear. Now the timing chain and timing chain cover to protect it from outside elements. Now crankshaft pulley so it could power water pump as well as the alternator, and a serpentine belt to basically link them all together, followed by yet another belt to deliver power to power steering motor, and a radiator fan to effectively cool down the engine. Quick look at the engine so we can figure out if there is anything else missing on the outside, only to determine that we have to lift the car up and place some rod caps. With all internals secured in place, we can finally mount the oil pan. And we can move on to assembly of transmission, starting with flywheel, clutch plate and clutch pressure plate. All performance by the way, with the clutch release bearing on top of all this. And the cherry on top being gearbox. Unfortunately, this one is just 3 gears. Starter comes next to allow us to start the engine, obviously. And now we can start assembling the exhaust system, starting with front exhaust section, followed by middle muffler, and rear muffler, which for whatever reason is a V8 type, even though the engine we've assembled is just 6-cylinder. Now we also have to place the fuel tank, as well as fuel pump, which also is going to be performance. And something that I forgot previously, which is the oil filter. Complete engine paves the way to suspension assembly, which starts with front suspension crossmember that will be used to connect most of the components down here. Steering rack, sway bar and front steering knuckles are the following components. Front axle knuckle covers will prevent ingress of dirt into moving parts. Upper suspension arm will hold it all in place. And front wheel hub will be obviously used to hold the wheel. And wheel hub bearing will allow rotation of moving parts. Now with all performance upgrades we also have to have performance brakes, and we have to cover the wheel hub. With brake caliper in place we can move on to tie rods that will allow control over the front axle. And a bottom suspension arm to secure the lower portion of this assembly. Now the outer tie rod, sway bar link, and prior to installing the last and most important part, which is the shock absorber, I had to fill in the rubber bushings that I forgot about. Nothing like an unsecured crossmember section. There are 4 in total. And coming back onto the double wishbone shock absorber, we have to assemble it before we are able to install it on the car. We repeat the same thing for another shock absorber, which we are going to use on the other side of the car, and we can finally mount it on the car itself. Now with this side done, I will move on to the other side of the car, but I will skip this ahead onto the back portion of the suspension so you don't have to look at the same thing twice. Leaf spring rear drive axle went in first, followed by rear axle knuckle housing and leaf spring. 2 rubber bushings to secure the leaf spring in place. Then wheel hub. Solid rear drive axle. This is going to deliver power from engine through drive shaft and rear drive axle to wheels. Now is the time to mount the ancient drum brake system, starting with drum brake cylinder, drum brake shoes, and brake drum itself. Last thing in here is the rear shock absorber, and we don't need to assemble it just like the front, as we've got leaf springs in here. And with the use of leaf spring plate and 2 leaf spring U-bolts, we are going to secure the suspension components on this side. And last thing underneath the car is the drive shaft itself. We have to secure it between gearbox and the rear drive axle. It is always a good shout to take a glance on the car parts list to check if you have missed something, as usually you won't be able to use your project car due to missing, often silly, components. Just like these 2 clips on the ignition distributor rotor. Okay, now we have to check the factory tire size, which is also going to tell us the rim size that we require. So I got 4 of these nuts, followed by 4 tires of required size. Okay, now we have to mount these tires on rims that we have purchased, and next we have to balance these wheels so the car doesn't vibrate into oblivion while we drive at high speeds. It is always a good idea to keep your tire changer busy while you are balancing the wheel, as balancing process is faster than putting a new tire. You can always save some time that you can use for, I don't know, balancing another wheel. Secure 4 wheels in place and we are done with the assembly. Now we can get on to finalizing our project car by filling in the required fluids and starting with the windscreen washer fluid. Followed by power steering fluid, brake fluid, most important, engine oil, and some coolant. Now with all fluids at correct level, we have to take care of wheel alignment so the car drives in straight line, super important at high speeds. Now, if we want to be super thorough, let's align headlights, and let's take our car to dyno. Right, let's do a test run so we can see how much power we have gained versus whatever came out of factory with no performance components. Nice, with all the upgraded parts we have gained additional 100 horsepower. Let's do some quick tuning. And run the same test again. Okay, so in total we've got 65% increase on horsepower and 60% increase on newtonometers, as in the torque itself. Let's send it and see what our hard work has given us. Not really a world-class acceleration. I don't really recommend driving on red line for extended periods of time, but hey, it's just a game, so we can, with no consequences. Right, so it's not gonna go any faster than that, clearly, especially with the 3-speed gearbox. And on this note, I would like to finish this video and say thank you for staying till the end. Leave a like or dislike accordingly, drop down a comment, maybe with some ideas for the future videos, and maybe, just maybe, subscribe if you kinda like this video. I've got more coming, so I shall see you in the next one. Dyno out.